Welcome dear friends to our first lecture on the first module of the paper Critical Studies 2 of the third semester MA English Language and Literature. Now this paper has 5 modules and I hope to discuss with you the first 2 modules of the paper Critical Studies 2. The 2 topics are postmodernism and new historicism. Let me remind you at the very outset that these online lectures are only a tip of the iceberg. Please supplement your knowledge with personal reading and research. So we shall straight away, without much introduction, get into our discussion of the first module of our syllabus, postmodernism. Postmodernism. Now, the world has witnessed the rise of postmodernism after the Second World War. The postmodernists are a group of thinkers who believe that they are the pallbearers of the modern tradition that originated with the enlightenment. The pallbearers of the modern tradition. We know who are pallbearers. The coffin carriers, or those who carry the flag that is together with the coffin. The postmodern literature is very often defined in relation to its predecessor, modernism. Now postmodern writers are seen as reacting to the precepts of modernism, and they often operate as literary bricoleurs, parodying forms and styles associated with the modernist writers. So they are the pallbearers of modernism. Postmodernism means after modernism. So in order to have a clear picture of postmodernism, I think we need to discuss a bit on modernism. I think you have already seen in your previous semesters something about modernism. Before we discuss modernism, let us see what is binary opposition. The structuralists believe in binary opposites. Now, in order to understand one thing, we need to understand the exact opposite of the same. So, binary opposition. So, binary opposition is a system of thought by which 2 theoretical opposites are strictly defined and set off against one another. Thus, in order to understand post-structuralism, we need to know what is structuralism. Now, in order to understand what is postmodernism, we need to have a clear idea about modernism. So, the binary opposites, we can say modernism and postmodernism can be considered as binary opposites. Now, postmodernism was a reaction against modernism. I said they are the pallbearers of modernism. Postmodernists were the pallbearers of modernists. Now, what is the difference between modern and modernism? So when we talk about modernism, we should have a clarity between being modern and what is modernism. The commencement of the discussion on modernism requires, I think, a clarification of these 2 terms, modern and modernism. Now what is modern? Modern is being modern means one does not adhere to the previous values and traditions. Now we call a person modern because he or she does not align to the accepted traditions and norms of the previous times, or he does not align to the accepted traditions and standards that are existing. Thus every age or every generation is modern compared to its preceding age. Each generation drifts from the previous generation, and this moving away, this drifting is termed as being modern. So the children are modern compared to the parents. So between 2 generations, there is a drift, there is a shift in the values, standards, norms, acceptable norms, etc. So when modern is understood in the historical sense, every age is modern compared to the previous age. So we are discussing a term called modern. In English literature also, we talk about the Old English period, which is from 500 AD to 1000 AD. There is a Middle English period that is from 1000 AD to 1400 AD. And the modern English is from 1400 onwards. And Chaucer is called the father of modern English or modern English poetry. So that is the word modern, drifting away from the accepted standards. Every generation is modern compared to the previous generation. Now what is modernism? Modernism is an aesthetic movement which began in 1910. It is a literary movement. It had nothing to do with being modern. Now 1910 to 1945 can be considered as the period of modernism in literary history, and the authors who represent this movement are, as you have already learned, T.S. Eliot and his renowned work The Wasteland, we have studied in detail, Virginia Woolf and her work To the Lighthouse, and we have heard about James Joyce and his works Ulysses and the portrait of an artist as a young man. So modern and modernism. Now all these works which I have mentioned, works of Eliot, Virginia Woolf and James Joyce, all these works contain the values of modernism. So we have defined two terms, modern and modernism. Modernism is not being modern. It is a literary movement that began from 1910 and would extend it to 1945. Now what are the factors that led to modernism? People in the early decades of the 20th century began to believe that the pillars of faith that held people together, the pillars of faith that held the world together were broken, were shattered, and that the world was fragmented without any scope for betterment. So fragmentation, the pillars of faith were shattered. As Matthew Arnold would exclaim in his poem Dover Beach, the sea of faith has dried out. The sea of faith has dried out. Now what were those pillars of faith that were shattered? We shall have a short description of the different pillars of faith that were shattered that will lead to modernism. The first pillar of faith that was shattered was God. The image of the creator God, the image of the provident God was shattered with the theory of evolution by Charles Darwin in his epoch-making book, The Origin of Species, which was published in 1859. And the atheist Nietzsche who declared that God is dead in 1882 to express the idea that enlightenment has eliminated the possibility of the existence of God. Thus, the first pillar of faith, God, was shattered. So we are talking about modernism, the factors that led to modernism. The first pillar of faith, the concept of God, was shattered. The second pillar of faith was the king. The king was considered as the representative of God. Now, there was a belief that king was appointed by God, the divine right of the king or the divine authority of the king. Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto of 1848 would shatter this pillar of faith as well. The hierarchical system was abolished. Democracy would be established. The faith in the king too was lost. The hierarchical system was demolished, shattered. The second pillar of faith, the king, that also was shattered. The third pillar of faith was the individual. The third pillar of faith that was shattered was the individual. With that, faith in the human mind was lost. Sigmund Freud, with his path-breaking book, The Interpretation of Dreams, which was published in 1899, would distinguish the conscious and the unconscious, the conscious mind and the unconscious mind and the subconscious mind. Now, he would say the conscious is just like the tip of the iceberg. A tip of the iceberg. Only 10% of the iceberg is visible. The rest of the 90% is invisible. Similarly, the individual is aware only of the 10% of the self. We are not in control of our mind. Thus, faith in the individual also was lost. So the third pillar, first pillar God, second pillar was king, the third pillar the individual. All the three pillars were shattered. The fourth pillar was democracy. As we have learned that the reform acts of the 19th century and the Chartist movement would end up in universal enfranchisement. universal enfranchisement, and the installment of democracy. People had longed for democracy. But the bloodshed of the First World War of 1914 to 1918 and in the Second World War, which was fought in the name of democracy, raised questions about democracy as well. So the fourth pillar of faith, democracy, also is being shattered. The devastating effect of the two world wars brought about fragmentation and disillusionment in the life of the people. Thus, the pillar of democracy also was shattered. The fourth pillar, democracy, also was shattered. The pillar of God, the pillar of the king, the pillar of the individual, and the next pillar of faith, democracy. Now the fifth pillar of faith that was shattered was science. Man had put faith in science. Science seems to provide answers to the basic questions of life. But it was this science that made possible the development of the atom bomb. And the science that seemed to be a pillar of strength lost its credibility and was shaken. It is from this feeling of fragmentation. So it is from this feeling of disillusionment that modernism would emerge. So what was the factors that led to the emergence of modernism? The pillars of faith were lost, shattered. We can rely on nothing. All the pillars of faith had crumbled, and the fragmented universe was a major premise of modernism. The fragmented universe was the major premise of modernism. Even though the fragmented universe was the accepted premise, man still believed that solutions are possible. Now this is specific of modernism. Even though there was fragmentation, man still believed that solutions are possible. This is the major difference between modernism and postmodernism. Modernism, while lamenting the fragmented state of the world, still believed that a solution was possible. But postmodernism was celebrating fragmentation. The First World War was followed by the Great Depression, the Cold Wars, and the Second World War. Now all these events, all these drastic events greatly contributed to the modernist thinking. Now we shall see some of the characteristics of modernism. As I said, these are only a tip of the iceberg. Please read up for yourself for extra knowledge. What are some few characteristics of modernism? First one, the modernism placed great emphasis on impressionism and subjectivity. Impressionism and subjectivity. How individual perceives, how impressions are formed in the mind, and how the individual responds. All this was given a lot of importance. The technique used was the stream of consciousness, and the modernist writers who used this method, the stream of consciousness method, are James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, Dorothy Richardson, etc. So the first characteristic that we can mention about modernism is modernism gave a lot of emphasis to impressionism and subjectivity. The second thing we can say is modernity moved away from objectivity to narration. From objectivity to narration. It experimented with multiple and plural points of view, not a singular point of view, not an objective point of view, plural point of view, and ambiguous moral positions. Nothing very clear, nothing very objective. The example of this is The Sound of Fury by Faulkner. So moved from objectivity. The third characteristic that we can say is that modernism gave way to blurring of distinction between different genres. Two or more genres were fused to form a hybrid art, or one genre imbibed the qualities of another. Now T.S. Eliot and E.E. Cummings wrote poetry that was considered close to prose than verse. Now the prose styles of Virginia Woolf and James Joyce, they acquired poetic qualities. So blurring of distinction between genres. So one of the key features of modernism was its emphasis on fragmented forms. They discarded the traditional focus on continuity. They discarded the traditional focus on coherence. They discarded the traditional focus on chronology but employed collage, a mixture of diverse characters, a mixture of diverse incidents and diverse images. Now, The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot is an example of this blurring of decision between different genres. The fourth characteristic that we can say is that modernism involved metafictional tendencies. What are metafictional tendencies? Self-consciousness about the production of a work of art. So, self-consciousness about the production of a work of art. It did not pretend to represent the reality. It will proclaim that it is a fiction, pointing to some reality that exists beyond the fictional world. The fifth point, the fifth characteristic that we can mention about modernism is that modernism rejected the boundaries between high and low culture. Modernism rejected the boundaries between high and low culture. So, my dear students, I shall not prolong this first lecture. We have just begun our discussion of postmodernism. We have had a brief look at modernism. We said what is the difference between modern and modernism. We discussed in brief about the factors that led to modernism, how the different pillars of faith were shattered and the world was considered to be a fragmented place. We also mentioned a few characteristics of modernism. More of it we will discuss in our subsequent lectures. So, my dear students, as we begin our discussion of this particular topic, postmodernism, I wish that all of us have a joyful learning. The role of the teacher is only to introduce the topic to you. As I mentioned in the beginning, beginning of this lecture, what I am presenting in this online lecture is only a tip of the iceberg. Please supplement the knowledge. Please supplement the knowledge of the subject with your personal reading. Have a nice time. Thank you for your patient listening.